dear all. We would like to welcome you to the second lecture of the OAF Hall lecture series, New Forms, and kindly introduce this evening's lecturer, David Leech.
Yeah, we are very happy to have David joining us. David Leech Architects was established in 2016. Before starting the studio, David worked for over a decade in several important European offices, including Herzog and de Meuron in Basel, Caruso in Gent, and 6A in London, and De Power Architects and Grafton Architects in Dublin. The practice has recently completed several built projects, among others, a conservatory room and a house in a garden in Dublin. And the studio has been awarded several prizes for its first works, including the winner of the Architects Journal Small Project in 2019, the winner in the Architectural Review House Awards in 2019, and the winner of the American Institute of Architects UK Young Architect in 2019. So I'll give the word over to David now.
Thanks, Sigrun and Hannah, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to get to talk about the work, not least because it actually gives one the moment to actually stop actually designing and stop thinking about the work per se as in the day-to-day of the office, but actually to stand back from it and try to assess what it is that we're working on or what it is we're trying to get together. Well, when Sigrun first approached me with regard to this talk, he suggested a few themes about what we could maybe delve into a bit more. Sigrun mentioned that in the series of lectures, you were interested in new and established practices and the idea of looking into the new. And I was saying to Sigrun, well, in my practice, the idea of new and established or collaborations and conversations is something that we are always engaging with. Although I'm a sole practitioner, I see my work completely as collaborations and conversations here in the present with colleagues who are here in the studio with me, but also very much so in the past with work that has gone on prior to work that I've done, and looking at history and looking at reference and precedent, and not just in architecture, but in art and in lots of different formats. So I wanted to start the lecture talk maybe a bit boringly by just reading out a quote from T.S. Eliot and the tradition and the individual artist. T.S. Eliot writes, "No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him, for contrast and comparison, among the dead. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is, where's my page? It's created, is something that happens simultaneously to all works of art which preceded it." In that passage that T.S. Eliot wrote, what I think he's really saying is that we never are designing in isolation. Whether we're extending an existing building or whether we're building a new building in the city, that new building is still an extension of the city. And we must always think of our work as collaboration and as conversation, both with the context around us, and the context can be political, social, financial. Of course, it's the physical built environment, but it's a historical context, both of the fabric of a city, but also of the idea and intent of architecture. The first project I want to show, which I think is on the slides now, is an exhibition we were invited to contribute to by the Architecture Foundation and Drawing Matter Archive here in the UK. Drawing Matter invited a number of architects from across Europe to engage with a drawing from their archive and to extrapolate or to translate that drawing to then make the next iteration in a model form. Marius Grofeld from Velwerk was curating it, and he picked this drawing by Bartolome Enfantin for us called Cité Militaire. It's a drawing there on the left-hand side. The drawing is it's a colorful ink and pencil drawing, and it seeks to establish a set of rules, I think, for a military camp, or I guess if you want to be more elaborate, an open metropolis. The drawing itself does not have any sight. The edges are left ambiguous in terms of that the drawing seems as a continuation of a plan that can be repeated and repeated with no determined boundaries. But what we were asked to do was to take this drawing and to try to read it. And I guess what was interested in, and in practice what we're interested in, is actually not necessarily reading accurately, but misinterpreting, misreading, and how these mistakes is a form of architectural translation, allowing one to move from just simply a conversation or a media dialogue with a past, with something that can potentially become one's own. It's almost like a game of Chinese whispers. So in the model you can see we made on the right hand side, we looked again at this drawing, but because of 21st century filters, all the knowledge that we've learned and has been established since this first drawing was done over 200 years ago, the ideas of modernism, the ideas of mise, how all these things have then put weight on us. So when we come to look at this drawing, our reaction wouldn't be what Enfantin would have necessarily done in his iteration, but of course it becomes a translation. So for us, this open plan that maybe spreads out wide in a landscape for Enfantin becomes a vertical continuation or a vertical plan. The allowance of technology, new modeling techniques means that this thing, instead of it being something that's more solid, it means something that's more filigree, and the translations are something that is more intuitive. I find it reassuring that the conversations that we have today are really the same conversations that been talked about in architecture for hundreds of years. I'm interested in the idea of an ambiguity or a complexity in architecture. And of course, that was talked about in the 20th century with Robert Venturi and complexity and contradiction. But even more than that, over 400 years ago, Palladio was also engaging and trying to tease out his thoughts on these ideas. Now, this is the Villa Sarrego in Veneto, which was built in 1570. And in this villa, Palladio is playing with the dichotomy or the duality of an urbane family who've moved to the country and you can even see it in the statues. There's a statue of Diana and there's a statue of Apollo representing the urban and representing the rural. But in this project, Palladio is trying to reconcile the scale, the form, the grandeur of an urban palazzo with its new context within a rural situation. So here Palladio looks at how he can try to make it feel more primitive, potentially more rustic, to make it feel somewhat more sympathetic to its surroundings. And by doing this and by modifying original intent, Palladio starts to adjust and to make a new sort of form. What I like about it is that there is this readings or multiple readings that can be understood. The building can be read one way for the inhabitant or the user, and in its scale and proportion, it has a grandeur, but it can also be read in another way for the passerby or for the visitor who might look at it and recognize in it these crude stone ensembles to make the columns something more closer to the cruder stone buildings of the countryside around. But Palladio exaggerates this. He makes these stone columns and it's almost as if the stones to form these singular columns have been made of lots of boulders that have been pushed down on top of each other. And Palladio exaggerates this by beveling the edges so you can almost feel the weight of each boulder stone pushing down on the other. Now, this is a complete conceit because in reality, to make this type of column, is a lot more expensive than the fine fluted columns that are made in the urban villas, which were simply brickwork and plaster on top of. Here, these are solid stone, lifted in place, chiseled. So the expense is more, but the impression is to give something that is less, or something that is more rustic and in tune to the simpler life of the countryside. In the next image, this is a slide. It's an installation by Fishley and Weiss from the Tate Modern in 2000. Fishley and Weiss did a lot of these sculptures in the 1990s and 2000s, but I first came across these type of installation in the Tate Modern here in London. And on first reading, you read it as everyday objects from an artist's studio that maybe have been left abandoned in the art gallery, and it comes across as something that maybe has a wit to it, or something that feels casual, or something that feels playful. But actually, this playfulness and casualness is actually undermined when you realize that each of these objects isn't as found, but instead has been carved from polyurethane and hand painted to make it look like an as found or ready-made object. In this installation, Fishley and Weiss are obviously acknowledging, or they're talking about the man-mades of Duchamp or ready-mades of Duchamp. They're criticizing process versus the reality. But what I found interesting is Pitty Fishley described these objects as phantoms because they're there in terms of their visual sense, but not in terms of their touch. And for me, as an architect, what that asks me is how I relate to this installation, but it's also how I relate to architecture and my architecture. What is more important, the perception or the reality? And I guess in terms of architecture, or in terms of building, what is more important than the architectural idea or the architectural experience? And for me, probably it's actual experience of the architecture rather than the idea of the architecture, which is more important. This is my own project. I guess this is something that I think is almost like a phantom in terms of that it is a wall building that's made to look like a stick building or a conservatory, which is made from slender elemental parts. The perception is there to make it feel like a everyday orangery that you'd see a lot of times in suburbia. These conservatories are often in cheap materials like PVC, sometimes in metals, but they become the language of suburbia. When the client approached me to do this project, they initially were wanting to build a conservatory at the back, and they were asking me to help them specify a shop of the conservatory from one of these large trade depots that come to bespoke, or not bespoke, off the shelf conservatory products. But looking at the cost, I realized that actually for the same amount of money that we could probably build them something bespoke and tailored to their needs. So we didn't have a huge budget. The budget for this overall was 60,000 euros for the extension. And that was the same price it was for one of these high-end conservatories we bought from the shops. So we needed to be able to make this in a way that could give them the impression or perception of the conservatory, or perception of an orangery, or the atmosphere of feeling being within one, but in a way that was able to be built economically. We started to think about this idea of what we call richly economic, which is using everyday, very ordinary materials, something that any jobbing builder could do. So we could get a local builder in to make this conservatory. And where we could, we would buy things off the shelf, like roof lights, windows, and doors. But where we were to make things on site, like walls and roofs and ceilings, where we had to actually assemble something, we put more effort into the design of that assembly to give the project a character. Therefore, a blockwork wall, by how it's arranged, can almost feel like, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but I'll try to point, like the plasters, which are just a block turn on its side, can almost feel like the columns of a conservatory or filigree type structure that we'd see in the garden. What was interesting to us is that when we've been looking at these small projects and we've been working with these tight budgets, is that 100 years ago, the expense in building was in the labor. Oh no, sorry, it was in the materials. So labor was cheap. So 100 years ago, you could have craftsmen which were affordable, who could work on site and make things that were very elaborate, had individual character, and it allowed the element become more than some of its parts. But nowadays, labor is actually the most expensive and materials are relatively cheap in comparison. So what we've tried to do in the practice is take the craft element that would happen on site and transfer that back into the studio and back into where we, through coordinate design and assembly, are faking a craft that would happen on site. So for a jobbing builder, there's no extra work from laying the blockwork like this or necessarily putting the joists in a diagonal pattern like this. But once it was acknowledged beforehand and once he knew what he was doing, it could mean that when the assembly happened, it felt almost as if it was crafted on site, although in terms of how it was built, it could be built quite crudely and quite expediently. So here in the image, you can see how the blockwork, it's a very local builder, not that skilled, was just put up very crudely. There's lots of snots from the plaster and render. It was a little bit wonky. You can see the joists up above. There's some gaps in between at the top, but it could be put up expediently and it could be put up quickly. And then in terms of how we work in the practice and this idea of richly economic, we then use elaborations, things like paint, color, linings, render, skirtings to conceal very quick and very expedient, sometimes crude building. So that's something that can, when the substructure goes up, feel quite rough, by then using paint and linings can then feel quite refined. And this doesn't really cost anything extra. These linings in comparison to the substructure are cheap, paint cheap, renders cheap, but they are a way of concealing any errors that might happen. I won't go into the details of this project, but we were interested in using illusion and depth as a way to give the impression of a project of a conservatory or a building that was made from individual stick elements, but actually when it was just made from the standard elements that you'd get to make any rear extension. The roof lights were shop bought, and then where the roof continues out onto the garden, we just simply remove the insulation and the roofing felt from above, and then what is the ceiling structure can become a pergola, which over time plants can grow up and grow across, giving them shade. This is a photograph I took of a wall near a site we had in London. The reason why I want to talk about this is because it, I think, encapsulates how we work in the office, often with contingency and through iteration. But we believe in an architecture of gestalt, where instead of a project having a singular, large, big idea, a project is instead made up of many smaller ideas that, due to their addition, the sum of their parts is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of their parts. What I like about this image is this is a gable wall, a brick gable wall near this house we were designing. And at some point, someone had come to this gable and had graffitied it. That was a chance encounter or opportune moment. But then the council, in reaction to this, came and they looked at the brick wall and they picked a tone from one of the bricks. They picked that tone, and then following the module of the brick patterning, they overpainted the graffiti. So again, the layers are being built up. But then someone came again and graffitied again over the council's new paint job. But the council came again, and then this time they took another color from the brickwork. And this time again, they followed the pattern of the module of the brick. And we have another layer washed on top of it. And what I get is, when I saw this, I thought this was a very beautiful wall, and I thought this was a very beautiful composition. But in some ways, it's chance, it's contingent, it's someone reacting to a process that went on before, someone reacting to a decision that went on before. And that's how we work in the office. We build things up slowly through iteration, through modification. Sometimes the next step will run in parallel or will work together with the step that happened before, or sometimes the next step might completely obliterate it. Generally, we always feel a project is most successful when the idea we had at the start is undermined continually through the process, so that's almost invisible, or just slightly a glimpse of it can be seen at the end. This is a house project we did in Dublin. The house is located at the end of a 1940s terrace, very suburban condition. In fact, the site, which is this area here, was the side garden of the end of terrace house. The estate is very typical in that it's made up of a street, and the houses have front and rear gardens typically off them and adjoining to the side. This site was bought by the client after the owner of this house, who had sold it to a developer, had tried 3 times to gain planning permission on this site, but the planning had been refused by the council due to what they perceived as a lack of outdoor amenity space or garden spaces. But when we went to visit the site, we were quite impressed that although we're in a suburban world and we actually really liked the quality of the suburbia that was around it, there's also this ambiguity or ambiguous quality because of this existing hedgerow. And when you went into the garden, and it's because it was overgrown, there's this distinct separation between you and your immediate surroundings. This garden had a kind of almost secret garden quality to it. And using that as a layer onto the layer of the planner's refusal due to outdoor amenity space, we thought that would be interesting, that if the garden was a problem that the planners had with this house originally when the other developers were looking at it, well, then when we came to look at the project, we'd make the garden almost the main driver for the house. This is the ground floor plan. Our first move was to push the house into the center of the site, or roughly center of the site, allowing that a garden could wrap 4 sides of the house all the way around. Within this then, a roughly square shaped plan, we placed the footprint of our building. A cruciform substructure, or a cruciform core structure, divides the roughly square plan into 4 rooms, an entrance, or 4 public rooms, an entrance, a dining, a kitchen, and a living. And within the cross-shaped core itself, we stack the ancillary functions. So we have bathroom, store, stair, kitchen, and fireplace. This diagram, I guess, is a diagram that's been used quite a lot by architects, where you have the served and the servant spaces. And Louis Kahn would talk about this in terms of the hierarchy between the public and the private. All the circulation for this house is located on the ground floor around the perimeter. So although it's quite small in footprint, it means that the house had a never-ending sort of quality in terms of that one could always continually walk from room to room to room. We are interested, talking about ideas of ambiguity, that the house would be neither made of rooms or open plan. So it'd be somewhere caught between a round plan and plan libre. We did that by pushing the crosses quite tight to the edges, allowing just enough room to form a threshold, but removing any doors that would be on the ground floor. Along the perimeter, we took away any structure and inserted it instead into the cross-shaped core. This meant that a timber and glass screen could be wrapped around the perimeter, giving direct connection to the small and varied gardens on all sides. With regard to planning, what we had to convince the planners by is that the outdoor space would, in fact, when it was required to be used, could be gained by the house, so that the outdoor amenity, rather than being defined by the line of the house, would instead be defined by the line of that cross-shaped core. This then influenced our interest in what the materiality of the ground floor of this house could be, because it being something that was neither a garden or a house meant materiality language would also like to reference that. So for instance, we wanted the floor to feel quite rough, almost like a patio floor, something that could be, when the doors are open, something you would see almost on an external footpath quality. But within that, then, we lined marble tiles, almost like a petrified rug. This was sort of a take of polished concrete, which has become a sort of bijou item, or where people now lay concrete floors, which was once seen as an industrial and efficient way of making a floor surface, but now through grinding, it's more expensive than actually laying the floor itself. So the polishing and the grinding of the floor is so expensive, we weren't able to afford that. So instead, we laid stone tiles almost as a reference to the smaller aggregates that you'd see in a polished concrete floor. So the floor has a quality that both feels rough, but then also refined due to the stone. When the doors open, they slide back and they stack at the apexes of the crosses. We were quite keen to do this, so that meant that one, the ambiguity or the complexity between the outdoor and the indoor was further made explicit, because to get from one room to the other, you had to cross that threshold or that line, go outside to then come back inside into the space beyond. When we were designing this house, we had a chance encounter. We went to visit the Smiths in Sugden House, and it had a lot of qualities that we found were similar to how we were thinking about planning our house. For instance, on the ground floor, the Smiths had developed a pretty much open plan situation using fireplace and stairs furniture to define spaces within it. But in addition to that, the Smithsons also had used a section to, within the large open plan volume, to define areas of different comfort, atmosphere, and use. And we were interested in how the subtle shifts in section could actually make one feel different in a room and maybe appropriate or inhabit that room differently. And that was something we wanted to take through into our project. So on the ground floor, we looked at keeping the ceiling constant to get the idea of this constant open plan quality. But then on the floor plane, we looked at stepping the floor plane to then introduce different thresholds and different qualities based on the proportion and direction of the room. So for instance, you step up into the house to disassociate yourself with when you enter, and then you step down into the kitchen living, and then down further into the living space proper, or the withdrawing room proper. So this is the photograph of once when you enter in to that entrance lobby with the low floor to ceiling height. You're greeted by a bookshelf immediately opposite you. This bookshelf, if I go back to the plan, is here, and behind it is a glass screen which then borrows or steal light from the main house into the bathroom behind, or the WC behind. We also liked having the bookshelf immediately opposite the entrance of the door, because it was almost like the name of the house. It would tell any visitor what the interests or what the hobbies of the owner were, so that they could almost, without meeting them, while reading their books or seeing their books, understand the personality of the house and of the owners. Looking back then down towards the kitchen, there's one step down which steps you down into the dining space. The dining space then is wrapped on two sides with a glass wall with the garden behind it when the doors are closed. And then you need to walk around that and then walk around the kitchen counter to get into the kitchen or the prep space for the kitchen behind. When fully opened then, the house has a different quality in terms of the garden and the interior become much more blurred. So you have the elaboration of a chandelier, at the same time beside the plant pots and vegetation of apple trees and variety of planting. Going around further then, you then step down more steps into the north facing part of the house, which is the drawing room or the sitting room. This is a room that has a fireplace within it. And its relation to the garden is different. It's sunken so that one can sit at the edges, and the garden here is much tighter and much smaller. So if the garden to the south side was about planting and about edible plants and getting out and enjoying the space of the garden, here the garden is more about viewing. It's tight, it's deep, and it's about sitting down on that side or on the side wall and being able to have a cigarette, both being in the house and being without. Then there's 3 more steps that take you past the WC and back to where we arrived at the start. This is an image from Le Corbusier's apartment in Paris, and we really like the surreal quality of this, and this at once recognizable elements, or I guess another way of describing it is it's something that's strangely familiar. We know all the parts, but we know the grass, we know the fireplace, we know the seat, but how they're put together makes it feel special. And that's something that we were keen to do in this house as well, so that on an autumnal evening, you'd be able to open up the sliding doors, put on a fire, and have this quite almost like camping in a house quality. Just something briefly touch on as well is that you can see on the wall, this is idea of where we've painted on this pattern. It's something we're also quite interested in, is where it's something that's quite small, a small element can actually play a big part. This pattern is painted on with gloss, or not gloss paint, sorry, varnish. So it's a clear varnish. So only when the light catches in certain days or when the lights are turned on in the evening does this pattern reveal itself. And we like that because I really enjoy architecture that doesn't announce itself or give itself away in one go as a one-liner. I much prefer projects that only on the second or the third time you visit them, you suddenly start to see something small that you hadn't seen before. Or I prefer architectural projects that reveal themselves more slowly, yeah, it's more of a slow cooked thing rather than something that's expedient and immediate and you get it at once. I'm interested in obviously history of architecture, but also in the architecture of the everyday. I'm interested in looking around what we see all around us and how that works, because there can sometimes be a disconnect between the world of the architect and the world of the user. And I don't always understand why that disconnect is there. And I think sometimes why it's there is because we don't always engage with the experience of the architecture, but rather we engage more with what I talked about before, the idea of the architecture. As I was saying before, we like looking at things we think we know, but then reevaluating them. So this is Joseph Coster's installation, one of 3 chairs, where he has a chair, a photograph of a chair, and a text describing the chair. Now, he didn't make any of these, he just curated them, put them together to make the installation. But it asks questions about representation and how one is represent something, but also it makes us reevaluate what we think we know and examine it in a way which you might find enriching or new or novel. This is Robert Venturi's Trubeck house in the States. And again, Robert Venturi here has just been using the elements of architecture that we recognize, the window, the porch, the roof, but by true subversion and an exaggeration, he's making it seem somewhat more punky. So it's almost like a kid at school who is wearing the school uniform, but has his shirt untucked and his tie kind of messed up. So he is at once engaged with what's around him, but also slightly disassociated with what's around him. You can recognize what he's part of, but also recognize that he's somewhat a part against. And that's something we really try to do in our architecture. So that's not completely one or the other, but there's an ambiguity, or there's a complexity to it. The arts and crafts could be seen as a high point, I think, in domestic architecture, but there in arts and crafts architecture, they also were just really reassembling the elements of the house in ways that were forming more picturesque compositions, things that we could associate with, but how they were put together gave it their refinement and made them special or beautiful. So when we came to look at this house, we really wanted to engage with the very ordinary pebble dash stucco of the surroundings, but we didn't want to just mimic it. We wanted to make it into something special. So we looked at how we could exaggerate it, add more stones to it, add more liquid to it. So it became more almost like a Hans Josephson sculpture in its gnarliness. But then by removing the stones and hand troweling it smooth, the same material could have a different sort of appearance and a different sort of quality and tactileness to it. Similarly, for the fixings of the roof slates, we looked at getting oversized crampions as a way, not really as a necessity to hold the slates in, but a way to add another layer or another order onto the pattern of the slate tiles. You start to get this diamond of these copper discs. This brings me on to another idea we're interested in practice, which is the idea of the applied arts, where something is done, like for instance, I guess the fixing of the roof, not necessarily for any immediate practical gain, but for aesthetic or for atmospheric reasons. This is a sculpture by Bernard Lavier, where he's used ordinary hose pipe, and he's just assembled a hose pipe in a way that's like unexpected, but there's a certain joyfulness from realizing, I think, both the splendidness of the installation, but also from the realization of how this kind of fantastical piece was made from the ordinary elements that are around you. This is another project we are doing in London, where we looked at using paint and the surfaces of timber to enrich and enliven the part of the facade that might be considered the main of a house. It's a timber frame building with timber cladding, and in most conditions, the timber cladding is just simply painted white. But then on that one facade, which faces onto the garden, we wanted there to be a kind of a festival experience or a festive type quality. So we use paint as a way not to increase any practical gain, but as a way to increase maybe an emotive gain. Similarly, on the inside of this house, we were looking at the room at the end, this room with this yellow Metzex ceiling. And here the engineer, when we were coming to design it, kept querying us for it. This is a house actually for an engineer. So the idea of redundancy was an idea that we were playing around with in the office. But as I said, I didn't want the idea to be the leading thing. What I wanted to be the leading thing is the experience of that idea. So we made lots of models of this to test this. But what it was is that it was kind of a bit of a joke with the engineer, because this roof could have been held up with 4 of these Metzex beams, but we instead held it up with 33 of them, because we wanted the ceiling to feel heavy above your head and experience it to be heavy above your head, but at the same time, because of the inherent quality of the light lattice of the Metzex beam, we wanted it to feel light, and it allowed the diffuse light to come down between it. Similarly, the light fittings or light fixtures, it could have been lit from 4 fluorescents, but instead we arrayed them in a pattern to make a constellation, to make a chandelier, which that's 22 or 23, I can't remember how many fluorescents to make it up. And back to the house in Dublin, in the main bedroom, we have pitched roofs. So the ceilings pitch in the same orientation as the roofs on the outside. But we wanted in the main bedroom to be a hierarchy, for this room to feel slightly special than the other rooms around it. So referencing Schinkel and the tent architecture, and I guess ideas of the qualities and the experience, the atmosphere of the softness of being within a tent, we looked at draping the ceiling here in plasterboard, not again for any practical reason or benefit for the room other than for the atmospheric experience of being in that room and feeling the softness of the curves underneath your body. I'll skip through this because I think I'm a bit short on time. But I'll just go back to it quickly, because what I wanted to talk about, maybe I won't have time to talk about it too much, is that when I talk about an architecture that we want things to reveal to themselves, maybe not on the first time, but on the second or third visit, to do that, we always try to make the minor elements the leading star. So for instance, in this case, this is the window for that house in Clontarf. The glazing beads, which are these L-shaped pieces that hold the glass in place. We wanted the glazing bead to become the major voice of the window. So we extracted the glazing bead, we made them into these overscale pieces, which we cut from sheet material, hence their L-shaped piece. And then we expressed the fixing and we expressed the joint between the two glazing beads. And this isn't something that anyone sees when they visit the house on the first or third time, or first or second or third probably visit, but it's something that when you're in the house and you've been there for a while, it's something that gives me great pleasure when I return back to. And I think those small moments is really how we read buildings. Humans are complex. We're not cartoons, and I don't think architecture should be cartoon-like either. And I think those small nuances and those small foibles are the things that make really quality buildings stand out. When we're looking at the house, we're interested in elements that can also double or have a double entendre to their meaning. So for instance, in this house, we're interested in how what looks like a chimney and what looks like a chimney in form and impression on the outside appearance can actually be on the inside have a different quality. So what is actually a chimney is in fact an extruded roof light to light the darkest part or the internal part of the center of this upstairs of the house. It's the part that when you take the stairs up, it's a very tight landing, one door wide and 2 doors in width. It's lined in timber, so it almost feels like you're within a wardrobe. But because of this 5-meter extrusion and this connection to the outside, you're always aware of the feeling of being of nature and knowing your connection to the world around you. The elevations for the house were each tuned based on what the context was and also on how they're responding to light and different conditions around them. You can see here the chimney and how that relates subtly to the surroundings, but how the house, because of its condition of this existing hedgerow, could have 2 very different attitudes to its representation on the exterior. On the ground floor, you basically have a glass house. On the top floor, you have a cousin, which is more similar to the existing surroundings. So really, it's these 2 houses are almost collided together. And then a downpipe is drawn across the facade where we thought there was too much wall or where we felt there wasn't enough idea or composition with it. The idea of composition and those oriented elements comes from our interest in photographers such as Lewis Bultz, who went around LA looking at these ordinary moments and then looking at how one sees things or how one composes something is a way that one can make the ordinary seem extraordinary. So on our back laneway elevation, where we wanted to have a plain facade, we made a relief of a door and a window, and then we drew a line of a downpipe just to balance the composition. This way of working is our interest in working with layers also comes from our interest in looking at art, and Rothko is a large inspiration for the office. And what I like about Rothko is that in his paintings, this is black and green in the Kunstmuseum in Basel, he paints like a watercolor artist. He builds up in layers So from what a distance might seem like a monolith and a black object within the gallery environs, you read it in a particular way. And what I like about building up in layers in architecture, it means that you can read things at different scales. So for instance, in this rock cut painting, when you see it in the gallery, when you see it as this from a distance, and from the distance scale, you read it as this black monolith, and you read it, the artwork in relation to the artwork around it, its relationship to the floor and the wall and its position in the gallery. But as you get up closer to it, the artwork kind of through these layers reveals a much greater depth to it. And that's what I really would like to have in my architecture, that through the layers, the depth is actually built up. It's not something that is, and sometimes these layers are contradictory, sometimes these layers are run in tandem with each other, but there's a richness and there's a that comes from this iterative way of working. I just want to talk about a couple of projects. I wasn't sure how I'm doing on time. Am I okay for time? I'll go on for a little bit further, but
just continue.
Sorry.
No, you're fine to continue for a while.
Okay, great. I'll just do two new projects then, which are kind of in process then to show how we're working kind of in the office. So in terms of the idea of collaborations and conversations, I've talked about how we look at references and conversations, collaborations with historic architects or architects who went before us and of different formats, including art practice and other practices, but also we are also in conversation with ourselves. And actually the projects we do in the office aren't always new, and they're often iterations of other projects in the office that we've gone before, or conversations that we've gone before, are different directions or the same direction we take depending on how things have panned out for other built work. So this is a project we're working on for 5 houses in Dublin. And really, in lots of ways, it's an iteration of that Clontarf house. And it's a Clontarf house taken and tessellated and expanded and developed. So what once was a singular house in the suburb now becomes a development within the suburb. In this drawing, it's a worm's eye, a planometric. So if you might be able to see, but you can see the cross-shaped core of the 4 houses, which comes from the Clontarf house. But actually, crucially, in this project, 1/4 of the core in each house has been left unroofed. So we have a courtyard here and we have a courtyard to the front. And this is a scheme which is called an alley and a courtyard, and alley and courtyard housing, because in the first instance, the most important move with this project was actually making the outdoor rooms, because that's what the planners want to see in terms of how you negotiate with the public space around you. What is the gesture although you're making a private building and you're working for the client, every piece of architecture needs to work for a user, the visitor, and the passerby. And each of those 3 kind of engagers with your architecture has you have a responsibility to, and they have a valid validity to use that architecture or to understand the architecture in a certain way. So for instance, although we're building a private development for a private developer, it still makes spaces that are part of the city around it. So it makes spaces to the front, but it also makes public streets, or in this case an alley, and a shared communal courtyard to the back. Taking the plan of the Clontarf house, we were interested in looking about how this project could be almost an amplification of the idea of no hierarchy between garden room or indoor room. So it's almost like a mat building where we have garden courtyards, internal rooms, outdoor rooms, and you all have a similar hierarchy. We are interested in engaging first with the public spaces, these outdoor rooms, how they be inhabited, trying to understand how one could make the non-built space as valid as the built space. So for the visitor, how someone would approach how would you make the proportion and scale and material of a laneway or alley so it doesn't feel dangerous, but hopefully will feel generous and engaging? How can you steal some greenery, excuse me, from the gardens around you, and potentially with windows get light and view from these gardens as well? So borrowing from the neighbors. How these shared spaces can almost tune between what is a shared public space, but then what starts to become a more intimate, private, but still off that public space before one gets into the room or into the house beyond. So we're looking at it in terms of the visitor and the user, but also in terms of the city and how these buildings would feel within the city. Looking at trying to use the elements, almost like Venturi of the chimney and the pitches, but use them in a way that was maybe slightly exaggerated or slightly subvertive. So it's at once part of the surroundings, but at once special. Venturi calls us both and I think that's something we always try to engage with in our architecture, that there isn't just one reasoning for doing something, but there's maybe two or three, so project can be understood in both and reasons. This is looking across from the gardens from a first floor bedroom of one of the next neighboring houses. This is then a section through one of those houses where you see the quarter, which has been has had the ceiling taken off, so it becomes an outdoor room, and you see the courtyard to the living spaces to the front. But in this house, we've allowed for a double height, or in the first instance, what is a double height living space. The idea being behind this is that the idea with these houses is that they have they're called an expandable house, in terms of that when the client or developer approached us, we were engaging with we were talking about very ordinary suburban houses and how and why they're so popular, why people are so willing to move into a semi-detached. But there's always a process of when someone moves into a semi-detached or a house that's already existing on these suburban conditions, that they're always looking about how they can change it, how they can make it their own. So these houses are very successful, these suburban houses, because they have many numerous ways where someone can go and start to alter the rear, start to alter the insides of the house quite easily to make it into something that feels of a character and atmosphere of theirs. So with our buildings, we were very aware that we didn't want to make something that felt like a finite piece of architecture, or something that felt that was very defined. But instead, we tried to look at trying to develop a typology that could allow the user to change it to their desires. So that external courtyard, which is the 1/4 of the ground floor plan, we have a structure that goes across it, almost like the pergola in the conservatory room project. It's made from this yellow metsec, and it's open to the sky. And we have the living room and a double height space and a double height glazing onto the court beyond in front. But within that living room, on this on the upper part of it, we have an opening, and we have light switches and sockets, almost as decorations, but almost as a trace of what could be the future. Around the edge, we have a frieze made of wall plates. This frieze is, in this version, it's decorative. It's something like we'd see as a wainscoting, but actually those wall plates are there for a purpose, so that when someone comes, and actually after a few years, if someone wants to change, they can use those wall plates to come along and put in new joists to potentially make a mezzanine to give them a study space above the living room, depending on how they want to use it. Or they could roof over the metsecs that were in the courtyard to make a rooflet space to this, what once was a corner court. Or they could completely floor it in and take down the wall in between, so you get a very long living space with a separate room now to the first floor above. So there's different versions of how one can use this house. And then within the surroundings, the language of the project is taken again from the backland language of its site. So we have a concrete block, which is laid in a way that kind of gives it an expression. But wherever the concrete block fronts onto a boundary of indifferent ownership, it gets a blank wall. And wherever we want windows, the windows are always to be viewing over a courtyard, over another courtyard. So the courtyards almost act as a buffer between you and your neighbors. So there's never a window on a gable onto a garden, different ownership. And then we were looking at using glass in a way, looking at glass in a way that isn't just about letting light and air in, but looking at how we could use office glazing systems, which are quite inexpensive as a unitized system, and how we can use them as a way of unifying a facade. So a facade that might be built from areas that are solid wall and areas that are open windows, we completely sheathe in one material to give it a neutral expression. Then that double height space, which might be glazed, fully glazed when it's in a double height living space, can then be altered as the room above changes. We also play with the idea of downpipes similar to the Clontarf house, but in this version, we also let the downpipes kind of act not structurally, but to appear to act structurally or to fake to act structurally, a bit like the Fischlian vise. So it looks like it's doing something structurally, but in fact, it's not. It's only to give the image or something that feels impossible. We're interested in using technology like new glazing systems, new structural systems, in the same way that the early British high tech had this real optimism about using systems. I really, in the conservatory room project, the green project at the start, which I showed you, the system we used was basically 2x4 timbers from Woody's DIY that a jobbing builder could use. But as the projects become elaborate, we want to engage even more with how we can use systems in a way that allows ordinary projects to take on something that feels more extraordinary. So in this house that Norman Foster designed for himself, he starts to use the materiality and the language of the office in a way to start creating spaces that have a span and a generosity that is unique within a house environment. Similarly, Michael Hopkins in his own house uses this more very delicate industrial architecture within the domestic environment to kind of make something feel almost like a line drawing, and the refinement comes in how the things are assembled and in the proportion and also in the habitation. I love the way he uses Venetian blinds as a way to make a screen, a material that is thought of as a way to screen the inside from the outside suddenly starts to screen the inside to the inside, and I like that way of thinking. This is a house then where we're trying to use technology also in a way that is not application, but is actually inherent to the architecture. So this is a house in rural Ireland, and for a house to be built in rural Ireland in a very beautiful area, it has to be seen as progression of a typology for the 21st century. So how can one live and build, importantly, sustainably in the 21st century in rural Ireland? And we weren't interested in the environmental being seen as a credential. We firmly believe in our office that all architecture needs to be sustainable, just like all architecture needs to have structure and all architecture needs to have material. It isn't, it shouldn't be a badge. And until it isn't a badge, until you can't look at a house and say, oh, that's built like that because it's really, really sustainable or has very good passive house credentials, it should just look like architecture first, and then it should just be sustainable and have the best energy efficiencies, because that's just best practice. So we are very interested in this house to use sustainable technology, not in a way of application, but as in the built fabric, in the same way that early high tech were using these technologies as built architectural fabric, not disassociating them, not disassociating the world of architecture, the world of M&E, and the world of energy. this house, I can show you on the site here, the site has an existing ruin on it, and that became the beginnings of this project. This ruin was seen as the route from which we then extended a new longhouse from. We made a space between the new extension and the existing room as an entranceway, and then the most important room, the house, this kind of special space, was given to be inhabited within the ruin. So this is the ruin itself, where we look at trying to condition that room, but not condition it by trying to remove the qualities of the picturesque or the charming qualities of the existing stone walls, by dry lining them, by putting insulation in, but instead by conditioning them by putting in a U-valued or a low U-value glazing system that could allow the walls be visible and the perception of them be intact, but still provide the conditioning that we required. We were also interested in this house, or we are interested in this house in terms of how we started to look at greenhouses and how one was using greenhouses in the countryside as a way to mediate between the natural and the wild natural and the artificial natural. But we wanted to use the greenhouse or the language of the greenhouse, but we wanted to look at how we could use photovoltaics, not something that was simply applied onto a roof, but how glass photovoltaics could become a new way of thatching or a new way of roofing the house in the countryside. So we're interested in cloaking the house and the roof with this glass PVs within a very simple aluminium painted glazing system. And we're also looking at how that would then step down the hillside so that the house would have a quality that is at once new, but at the same time has references and attachments to the historic and earlier typologies of the landscape around it. I wanted to talk about how we use the downpipes here, not necessarily in a way that was applied art where we're using them just for the sake of how they work, but we have on this project, I can probably see in plan, for a 120 square meter house, I think we have 90 downpipes. And those downpipes are a way of sustainably draining into the ground, not at a single point and requiring extra infrastructure, but allowing the ground to be able to take from the individual pipes water directly to it and percolate into the soil around it. The idea with this house is that it has no touch or no new infrastructure is needed for it to be built. So it doesn't attach onto an electrical grid. It gets its own water from a borehole. It's completely self-sustaining. But at the same time, in terms of how it embraces the ruin, it should hopefully feel at once modern, but at once part of its existing landscape. This is as it steps down the site. And then these glazed walls with these outshots pushed into them that have inhabitation. And then as a stair falls down to this large picture window that has a view of the bay behind. I just wanted to skip through those slides because I know I'm running over time, but I just wanted to end on this slide, which is it's a print by Idris Khan called Homage to Hildenberger Burns Becher. And it's older gas holder images, one on top of the other, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, a bit like how I've been talking before about building things up. But what I think is really important here is that in this image, the beauty of it isn't the individual layers, but it's in the final composition. It's in the synthesis of the layers. And for me, it can be sometimes quite strange to talk about my projects and almost dissect them and talk about each individual element separately, because really, for it to be successful, I hope the experience of it isn't that you read every element, but like this Idris Khan image, it's a synthesis of all these ideas that makes you just feel a certain way. And thank you very much.
Thank
Should I
you.
stop sharing my screen?
We can also just leave it.
Okay. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions.
Great.
If you don't mind.
No.
I was wondering, you have spoken before about the importance to invest in the design work in the beginning, in order to achieve some certainty in the project, like for example cost certainty or certainty for the contractor. And I wonder if you can like elaborate a little bit of how the process is in the studio and maybe what tools you use to achieve that.
Yeah. So yeah, I was actually thinking of that when I was putting together the lecture. It would be nice actually sometime to just put a lecture together on the process. But the way we work in the office is that we try to take any decisions that could happen on site. We try to enable them to happen in the design process within the studio. So often when I've been working in other offices, I found that we could get to site and there would be moments that things that surprise you, that you've been drawing analytically, drawing empirically in plan and section, but those drawings that we were doing in these offices wasn't how you'd feel or experience the building. So although a building, it's a very modernist thing, a lot of modernist architects would design from the plan, and almost their projects were an extrusion of the plan. But it was only when you actually went to see the plan start to get built up around you, often when you're on site, you go, oh, I should change this or I should change that. But actually, that's why we make these large 1 to 10, 1 to 20 scale models, is so that we really try to determine as much as possible in the design side or the design end. So we really front load the design end so that when we're on site, we don't need any requests for further information. We are confident that everything that we have looked at within the process in the studio is how it should be built on site, which means that then, because there's no changes in site, there's cost certainty. Generally, we draw everything, so it's a lot of work. So our tender packages and our construction drawings are generally quite heavy, and often we're told quite much more elaborate than other architects. But that means that when we get prices back in from builders, they unfortunately probably means they come back slightly higher than if we sent in something that was more vague, but it means that there's cost certainty there. And it means that when we get the prices in, we have a shopping list of what we can take in and take out from the project. But the important thing is that we are always absolutely confident, and we're not confident architects. I would say that my practice and I am we're very unconfident, but lacking that confidence and makes us test everything. And because we test everything, we can be then fully sure that when we go on the site, that everything is how we would like it or how the client would like it. So I could probably do like a 3-hour lecture on just the process alone, but we work at all scales simultaneously. So we're obviously looking at the scale of the city, and we're looking at how, when I say the scale of the city, I just mean like it could be the scale of a rural landscape as well. But I'm looking at the scale of how one experiences something within the greater, wider context. So we're studying that and how you experience your project or your building within that. So we're very interested in the imagery you make is experiential. It's taken at eye height. It's not abstracted, or of course it's abstracted, but it's abstracted in a way where we're in control. But the images are as close to how one would experience it, because architecture is really, at the end of the day, experience. It's not intellectualized, and it's not thought about in terms of abstract concepts. It's talked about it's felt when you're within it. And so we are always working. Of course, we have to work with the empirical drawings, plan, section, all the drawings that talk about information. But as well as working those empirical drawings, we are always working in tandem with experiential imagery or experiential drawing. I don't know if that answered the question. Or I can expand on it if you like.
I also actually have a question which is a bit not similar, but also about kind of the practice and and the processes, because you said something which I find very interesting about this, like the perception or reality, and kind of what of the two, or what is important. And you say for you it's maybe the experience, and also this with kind of the combination of symbols and associations of things that I feel are very present in your projects. I was just thinking that it gives kind of a freedom in the process of designing, but it also adds a very personal dimension to it. So I was just, which I think is a very beautiful thing, but I was wondering how this, if you could say something more about that, and maybe also about this and working together, like this personal dimension of it and working.
So in terms of the architecture being personal, I really don't have any idea of what a project's going to be like, and I have no preconception of what it's going to be like. But I think it feels personal because, like, for instance, that very colorful facade of that house we did in London, the red and green one, the client there he wears Margaret Howell. He likes very organic. He wears very neutral. He likes different shades of gray. When we first talked, there was no way if I said that we were going to have a very colorful house with yellow ceilings and that it would happen. And it happened very organically and very naturally, where initially we made that project with a lot of pale whites and pale grays, but we were making these imagery, and it just, to both of us, it felt like it wasn't right. And we were just testing things. And in some ways, we stumble upon things. And this stumbling upon things, rather than forcing an idea, means, I think, that sometimes projects can look a lot more, you can be bolder, or they look a lot more bolder, or as you say, like, it looks like it comes from a hand. But really, the only, like, all the drivers in the project, like, a project is only good if the more constraints a project has, the better it is. If you were given a blank canvas and said, go and build this, it's almost an impossible task, no? Because what are the constraints? What are the drivers? You have nothing to react against. But when you have so as a sole practitioner, when I have a client, we have a conversation. That's one layer of a project. Sometimes we have existing buildings, but we always have sites or existing sites. That's another layer of a conversation. We have budgets. That's another layer. And all these things kind of impact and start to kind of, like, it's almost like the sculptor that has the block of stone, and depending on the weakness or the strength of the stone, it tells them what sort of statue you can make out of it. And I think that's really how we work in the studio, in terms of that, because the ideas aren't us intellectualizing them and being confident and kind of saying we think this works. Instead, by saying, well, this could work, and, like, what I show is the things where we got them at the end, but the amount of process to get to that point, the amount of things that are thrown away, or ideas that have been dead ends, is quite, well, for me, that's also the project. The project really isn't the built building. It's nice to have built buildings, but actually in my studio, the projects are actually the process of making these thoughts, and the conversations and the collaborations are really what mold these projects. There isn't really anything singular, or we really try to avoid have any singular identity. I think I'd be very disappointed if someone could read a project in one go, or understand it in one go. I don't know if that really was that. Is there anything else to that you'd like me to add, or?
No, I think it was, yeah, it was nice. I was just also thinking when you were talking now that it's also interesting, when you talk about perceptions that you enter a room, and also this thing idea with symbols, and also
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. This a lot of my ideas are coincidence. Like, you know, it comes from certain the context of the projects we have in the office, and this idea of perception came about from when I worked in other offices, and they had much larger budgets to do very experimental projects, and there was a belief somehow, and I think it came from practice I had worked in, and teachers I'd been taught by, this idea, maybe a modernist idea, that there's a validity, or there's something valid, there's something good about truth and honesty. Like, you know, and they would reference Mies as being an exemplar of this, when of course Mies was always, what you call it, like, you know, faking things, like at the Crayfield Villas or at Seagram, that was planted on columns. But for me, I I wanted people to have the feeling that they want in their projects or buildings. If they want to have something that feels rich or feels luxurious, and they don't have the budget to do that, that doesn't mean that they have to then have this fake austerity aesthetic of, like, you know, raw plywood walls, or bare blockwork walls, or concrete floors. Because the truth of that is that that type of aesthetic, which kind of almost seems to be a symbol that kind of says, oh, we made it like this because we didn't have much money, so we expressed the structure, or we showed the structure. But the reality of it is that to make something that where you express a structure, or you use things very plainly, it has to be assembled in a beautiful way for it to have a quality. If it's like, if you get plywood and you slap it up, it feels like it's a DIY. But if you have plywood and it's suddenly very beautifully jointed and very beautifully assembled, it, it's very expensive, because that's craft, and craft is something that we can't most people can't afford crafted architecture now. Like, crafted architecture is for the wealthy, it's for the bijou, and I'm about having an architecture that's open to all. But that doesn't mean that you can't have the perception of something that feels crafted, because the craft is actually often talked about how one thing is put together, and that can happen in the design stage.
We have a question from the audience.
Yeah.
We'll read that out. This is from Sara Kantele. She wonders, what is the climate in the site of the first garden house, the one in Dublin, most likely? Coming from the north, I'm thinking of energy issues and inside temperature.
Okay. Well, yeah, no, that's a really good question. Like, that house is, what I really like about that house is that's an A-rated house. So it has the highest energy efficiency that it could attain in Ireland. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't look like it's an A-rated house, because exactly what you just said, there's glass all the way around it, and there's glass on the north side face. And I really like that. I really like that you can have something that is energy efficient by thinking about things differently. So that glass is all triple rated glazing. We had to offset the insulations in different areas to allow for the amount of glazing that we had, but it's all doable. We work with a very good energy consultant, and it's all doable. The only thing we couldn't do in that house is I think passive house is 18 kilo. I can't remember kilowatts. That house is 37. We couldn't get it to be passive house because of the doors to make it airtight. But yeah, like it is meant to, one of the requirements to get it to the A rating was that it has to have a wood burning stove in it. But when the fire is lit, you have to open the windows. It's crazy, like, you know, but there's a certain amount of box ticking where people think that, okay, if you want to build something sustainably, you can't have windows on the north side. That's absolute nonsense. Of course you can. You just need to think about things in a more open mind. And I think that's really important, because, you know, until all A-rated buildings look like just buildings, people are there's going to be an issue. Like, you know, if, for instance, I couldn't have put windows on that north facade because I couldn't get the energy efficiency. But then, people aren't going to want to get the energy efficiency because there might be other reasons why you want the windows on the north facade. So you have to think about things in a way that enables that. And with current technologies, it's completely doable. Like I'm all for embracing the rise and new types of insulation and new types of glass. Like, it was amazing in that house in Clontarf. The hardest part, I didn't talk about it today actually, but the hardest part of insulating the ground floor wasn't the glass, because that was just about buying the product. And we got a triple glazed unit that had 0.7 watts per meter squared Kelvin. But the most difficult part was the frame of the window, because that was a bespoke made window, was how we could actually get it framed. So we wanted timber windows, but we actually had to, the timber couldn't be the frame of the window. We had to thermally isolate them. We had to break them with insulation all the way between. So it's quite funny that, like, the glass, that people all think is the problem, and that no one worries about doors because doors are timber and kind of slightly insulating, but actually they're the weak point. And I think that's what we need to do, is really start looking at the advancements in technology, not to fetishize them. Like, I really admire high-tech architecture, early high-tech architecture, but what I admire about it is its optimism. It had an optimism of using technology and systems. Where I completely lose interest is in the fetishization of efficiency and economy. So for me, in the house where we did with the yellow Metzek ceilings, the reason why they're painted that yellow is because it's the same color that Norman Foster painted on the Swindon factory. But where Norman Foster could only have made that structure in the system that was most efficient and expedient, I was much more interested in the idea of redundancy. So that cost the client more to put in that amount of Metzek. But we made the model and we made the drawings, and we said to him, well, we think it's worth you paying the extra money to put in that, because it will give you an emotive benefit, or an atmosphere, or a character that actually the efficiency or the economy or what the practicality is telling you. It's the same as the idea of applied arts. It's basically what applied arts is.
Thank you, David. I think we could, of course, go on for much longer, but fortunately we're a bit running out of time. So
right.
I think, we just want to thank you so much for this really very interesting lecture.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for everybody who participated. Well done. And yeah, hope to see you soon.
Well, thanks very much, Hannah, and thank you so much for the invitation. And yeah, hopefully I'll get to see Oslo at some point. I was very disappointed not to be able to come, because I've never been. But yeah, I hope to get to see that in the flesh when all of this when we go back to normal, hopefully soon.
We'll try again when things are a bit more normal. Let's say.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.